Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to this topical talk on understanding educational inequality. My name is Nigel Kettley, and I'm a senior lecturer here at the Institute of Continuing Education, and I've been researching in the field of education since 1997. But before we begin in detail, I thought it might be helpful for you to have some understanding of the reason for my interest in education. I actually started my career in the late 1980s as an A-level teacher, and I spent 10 years teaching A-level economics, sociology, BTEC, and various other subjects. And during my career as an A-level teacher, I became profoundly interested in those factors that influence how well pupils do in their GCSE and A-level examinations. And from there, I eventually returned to Cambridge as a mature student and did a master's and PhD in the subject area. So what I want to do in this topical talk, technology allowing, is I want to start off by thinking about what is educational inequality, and considering why educational inequality is so important for people's lives. And I think particularly at the current time, we can all appreciate this, and we'll have seen in the media, for example, speculations about how lockdown has been affecting the education, particularly of those from less advantaged backgrounds. Once I've said a little bit about what educational inequality is and how we might measure it, I want to look at some of the empirical evidence related to the extent of educational inequality in society. And I want to consider, for example, is educational inequality diminishing? Is it persisting? What is happening, particularly in terms of socioeconomic or social class differences in education, and also in relation to participation in higher education? And the final thing I want to do in this session is talk about how academics have tried to explain educational inequality and what policies they've recommended to overcome it, and think about whether or not those policies are successful. I think it's absolutely fundamental to start this presentation by addressing one of the big issues here. Many people will argue that education is a really profoundly influential and powerful tool for changing society. So in recent years, under the coalition government and the contemporary government, we've seen a huge amount of emphasis placed on education and social mobility as a way of promoting a more just and a more equal society. And these formulations of education and educational inequality, whether it's related to gender, ethnicity, social class, use the phrase, but they very rarely drill down into a definition of what we mean by educational inequality. And for me, there are three key components to any definition. I'm talking about inequalities of opportunity, I'm talking about inequalities of resources, and inequality of outcomes. And particularly in this session, we're going to be focusing on outcomes. For example, A-level exam results, and we're going to be talking about participation in higher education. But we shouldn't forget, we're also talking about inequality in opportunity, the type of area you live in, the type of school you attend, how well resourced that school is, how well qualified teachers are, etc. So throughout the presentation, I'd like you to have at the back of your mind, can education actually change the world? Can it promote a more socially just society? And this is fundamentally one of my reasons for being interested in this research topic. To some of the nitty-gritty technical things, how might we measure educational inequality? Well, when I started my work on this subject in the late 1990s, one of the most popular definitions was that of Madeleine Arnaud in the University of Cambridge Faculty of Education. And she talked about educational gaps between men and women, middle-class students, working-class students, Black students, and white students. The idea of educational gaps have been around since at least the 1960s, but they're simply a way of measuring the proportion of students who enter and do well in particular subjects. For example, GCSE maths or GCSE English. So a gap simply refers to the difference between two groups measured using a particular indicator. And there are lots of ways of measuring educational achievement. The most common preferred by the government are called benchmark measures. And these take, for example, the proportion of students who achieve 5 grade C or higher GCSE exam results and compare it to those who don't achieve at that level. These sorts of measures become more and more complicated. For example, in my own research, I focused on using total and mean point score measures of educational inequality. And these are more sophisticated because they assign numerical values to particular grades in a subject, and then sum these up and take the mean of them. And finally, if we think about participation in higher education, a standard way it's measured by the Department for Education is the Higher Educational Initial Participation Rate, which looks at the likelihood of young people entering higher education before their 30th birthday. And just out of interest, in 2015, the higher educational initial participation rate stood at 49%, meaning nearly half of people will go on to higher education. But when I went to university in the early 1980s, it was about 10%. So we've seen a substantial growth in participation. If, like me, you're addicted to reading the news and watching the TV, you'll have seen a huge amount of speculation in the press at the moment about the likely impact of the current pandemic and lockdown on educational attainment and inequality, particularly between working class and middle class pupils, or those living in poverty and those who are more privileged. So, for example, both of these articles are taken from The Guardian, and we have a summary of recent research by the DFE, which shows that in the last 2 years, the gap between advantaged and disadvantaged pupils has actually widened. And then we have an article summarizing research from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which points out that better off children in lockdown are spending 30% more time on study. And there's been a huge amount of speculation about how this will affect the long-term educational and career prospects of working class or less advantaged pupils. And so far, what we've said might actually seem quite abstract and irrelevant to our own personal lives and experiences. But in this matrix, this presentation, I focused on the issue of life chances. Now, you may have heard the phrase life chances in Parliament, in the media, on the BBC. And it's quite fascinating the way sociological terms have infiltrated political discourse. And the phrase life chances simply means your ability of obtaining desirable resources. So, for example, going to university is a desirable resource. Owning your own home is something as a society we elevate, we attach status to. So your life chances refer to getting culturally approved resources. And in education studies, your family of origin and your social class of origin are profoundly important in determining the whole of your life course. So the class you're born into will often influence very strongly the school you attend, the quality of teaching you receive, that in turn will influence your educational outcomes. How well do you do at GCSE? How well do you do at A-level or the International Baccalaureate? In turn, influencing your occupational destinations. Now, some of you might sneakily be thinking, oh, this is all incredibly deterministic. We're not determined purely by where we're born and the social class into which we're born. And I would agree fundamentally. So, for example, some working class children do particularly well in school and experience upward social mobility and better income, which may influence and change their tastes, leisure activities, their political participation. And ultimately, this matrix or web of influences, which are your life chances, will influence your health outcomes. So, for example, we've seen a lot currently on coronavirus and the relationship of the mortality rate to your socioeconomic background, and estimates from the Office for National Statistics showing that people from poorer backgrounds are twice as likely to die of COVID-19. So all the time, please bear in mind that the coming statistical generalities refer to real people and the life chances of real people. The first piece of empirical evidence I wanted to talk about is taken from the 2019 Sutton Trust report on the elite in Britain. And the Sutton Trust basically define the elite as people who come from families where one or both parents hold highly prestigious occupations. And if we look at the first bar on this chart, we can see that 7%, only 7% of pupils in England actually attend independent or public schools, and 5% attend grammar schools. Thus, 88%, the vast majority, attend a state-funded, comprehensive or equivalent school. But if we then look at the social experiences of the elite in terms of education, nearly 40% of them attend public or independent schools, and 20% highly selective grammar schools. So here we're already beginning to see how the family that you are born into and your social origin influence the type of education you receive, which plays out through your educational outcomes, and also plays out in terms of your participation in higher education and your occupational success. The following slide shows something that I remember reading when it was first published in the year 2000. And some of you might actually be sat there thinking, well, why is he referring to something that's 20 years old? And I chose this extract from the report of Gillborn and Mirza, which is a report that maps the relative effect of ethnicity, gender, and class on GCSE achievement. And it uses a benchmark measure. It compares pupils who get 5 GCSEs and those who don't in percentage terms. And I think this is a really important summary of the situation of inequalities, because it shows us the relative size of attainment gaps. So the table actually standardizes to the national average at 0 levels of performance and compares girls and boys. So the gender gap is relatively small, with girls achieving about 5 percentage points above the national average and boys achieving below it. If then we look at the ethnicity gap or the race gap, and this has actually been measured in a way which is relatively crude by comparing the performance of white and Afro-Caribbean pupils, we see that the size of the ethnicity gap is much more substantial than the size of the gender gap. But most importantly of all, if we look at the comparison Gillborn and Mirza make between people from managerial and professional backgrounds achieving 20 percentage points above the national average to those from unskilled manual backgrounds achieving more than 20% below, we see that the social class gap in achievement using these measures and definitions is by far the greatest form of inequality. Now, there are 2 points at this stage we need to remember. These are relatively crude measures, but they do give us some overall indication of the size of social class inequality. And this is why I chose to focus on this issue in today's presentation. They also, I think, highlight the importance of the interaction of these different personal characteristics. So, for example, we need to start realizing that individual pupils may experience multiple or triple disadvantages. So, Black boys from working class backgrounds in education may be doubly disadvantaged because of the intersection of their ethnicity and their socio-economic background. So that's some sort of historical background on patterns of educational attainment. You may now be throwing your hands up in despair at the complexity or seeming complexity of the following table. This table takes data from the Department for Education that was published in 2019, and it looks at measures of inequality by socioeconomic background at level 3 attainment. And level 3 attainment is basically referring to attainment at A level or equivalent standard. And what I've actually done here is I've provided a summary for the data available running from 2005 to 2018. And I've chosen 2 key measures. So I've chosen free school meals as a measure, being eligible for free school meals or not being eligible for free school meals. So this is an indicator, is a proxy measure of social background. And currently, I think about 15% of pupils in England receive free school meals. Lots of you may actually be thinking, but free school meals isn't actually a very effective measure. And I would agree, there's been a lot of published research that challenges the accuracy of free school meals as a measure of deprivation and inequality. But using this measure, and this is one the government seems to prefer and is readily available, we can see that the gap between those eligible for free school meals and those not eligible was 26.5% in 2005. And if we compare that to 2018, the gap is now 25.7%. So the gap has declined, but very marginally. And as I said when I was referring to the Guardian article earlier, that if we look at the years 2016, 2017, there's actually been a marginal increase in the gap between those eligible and not eligible for free school meals in terms of their level 3 or A-level equivalent attainment. Another measure that the Department for Education provide is comparing pupils from the most deprived areas and the least deprived areas. So 25% least deprived areas compared to 25% most deprived areas. And using that measure in 2005, the gap was 35.7, but that percentage gap has declined 23.9% in 2018. And this looks like a much more creditable and remarkable achievement, which would seem to imply that socioeconomic inequality is diminishing quite substantially. I think, however, we need to take this with a sort of pinch of salt or caveat. We need to start thinking about what qualifications these pupils are taking. So, for example, using the free school meals measure, and this applies equally to the deprived measure, that pupils from more advantaged backgrounds tend to be taking qualifications such as A-level and the International Baccalaureate, which are readily translatable into participation into higher education. But pupils from more deprived areas are often taking vocational qualifications, which have less currency in progression to higher education. It's also true to say that the Education and Skills Act of 2008 actually increased the amount of time people had to spend in education, increasing the age initially to 17 and then 18, which meant de facto more people from deprived backgrounds were staying in education and doing some form of qualification, which may in and of itself have a tendency to reduce the gap. This is probably the most straightforward of the slides in terms of evidence related to inequality in participation in higher education. So here again, I've taken Department for Education data on participation in higher education, comparing free school meal and non-free school meal pupils. And the comparison period is 2005 to 2017-18. And if we follow the lower line in this diagram, we can see that the percentage of free school meal pupils entering higher education has increased from 14.2% to 26.3%. So this is a good news story. More people who have received free school meals are progressing into higher education. Of course, we have to ask ourselves what type of higher education they're progressing into. Is it highly selective Russell Group universities, or is it post-1992 universities? Nevertheless, despite that improvement in the progression to higher education of free school meal pupils, the rate of improvement of those not in free school meals has tended to keep pace, if not outstrip. So the top line indicates the progression of non-free school meal pupils into higher education. And we can see in 2005, that was 33.5%, and in 2017, 44.9%. So we started off a gap with 9.2 percentage points. We end up with a gap of 8.6 percentage points. And in the last couple of years, the gap between those two groups using this measure has actually widened slightly. So again, this is all very abstract, talking about trends and patterns. But we're beginning to see by many measures the idea that socioeconomic inequalities in achievement in school and progression to higher education are relatively persistent. They have not been substantially ameliorated. This is perhaps, again, a relatively controversial issue. As somebody working in the University of Cambridge, I thought it was really important to turn the spotlight on Cambridge as an organisation and think about Cambridge in terms of socioeconomic inequality of the students who end up entering the university. All of the data on this slide is available from the University of Cambridge's own website, and it reports the outcome of recruitment annually and uploads the report to the university website, and this material is taken from there. In 2018 in Cambridge, there were over 18,000 applicants for just under 3,500 places. So it's an incredibly competitive university to get into, unsurprisingly, given its relative elite status. But then if we start to look at people admitted to Cambridge in 2018, 2019, 34.8% of them came from public school backgrounds. And I remember I said at the beginning of this presentation, only 7% of the general school population attend an independent or public school. And this figure is much more closely aligned to the Sutton Trust notion of the education of the elite than the general population. So 65.2% of people admitted had actually come from state school backgrounds. Importantly, I don't want to participate in Cambridge bashing or undue criticism in this presentation. And during my time doing research on the University of Cambridge, right back to the early noughties, when I was doing research for the Cambridge Bursary Scheme Evaluation Project, the percentage of people admitted to the university from public schools has actually declined. In the early noughties, it was close to 50%, and now it's only 34%. So there has been some progress on that measure. If we look at other measures though, Polar 3 is a measure which looks at high participation and low participation neighbourhoods. So it looks at your postcode and your background area, your geographic area. And Polar 3 quintile 1 is pupils coming from low participation neighbourhoods. Quintile 5, high participation neighbourhoods. The quintile 5 is often treated as a proxy measure for relative advantage. So just under 6% of applicants in 2018 came from low participation neighbourhoods, whereas over 45% came from high participation neighbourhoods, as though the advantage of a particular type of social background was feeding into their education and their plans for progressing in higher education. When we break down these figures further, we'll see that only 16.5% of applicants from quintile 1 were successful. So in 2018, only 112 disadvantaged students who came from quintile 1 were successful in their application to Cambridge, whereas from quintile 5, it was 25%, just over, equating to 1,343 students. The other way of measuring access to Cambridge is using socioeconomic group or a measure of social class. And one of the standard measures has been the Office for National Statistics measurement of socioeconomic group. But in 2015, HESA, the Higher Education Statistics Agency, actually decided that the measurement of social class in universities was so inaccurate that it withdrew the measure. And its inaccuracy reflects the fact that many students who, when they apply to university, don't accurately declare the occupational background of their parents or guardians, or they just say nothing at all. But the last time figures were available, just over 10% of students admitted to Cambridge actually came from low socioeconomic group backgrounds, compared to 33% of the sector as a whole. Now, I don't think these figures for Cambridge are particularly surprising or particularly remarkable, and they're publicly available. But I do think we have to start to acknowledge what the university is trying to do about this situation. So, for example, I'm giving you a presentation today organised through the Institute of Continuing Education. And the Institute of Continuing Education has been around since 1867, when James Stewart started outreach work trying to take Cambridge to working men and women in the north of the country. So Cambridge has a long and proud tradition in outreach work trying to widen participation. More recently, it started working on a foundational transition year. It does a huge amount of summer school work for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds, and a lot of outreach work with schools in particular neighbourhoods. And this in and of itself is interesting, but the problem of socioeconomic inequality in access to the university is relatively persistent and appears somewhat intractable when we look at the rate of progress over the last 10 or 15 years. The way I want to start drawing my presentation to an end is trying to think about the ways that educationalists and sociologists have tried to explain persistent inequalities in access to education and in achievement at schools. The following table is actually drawn from a book I published in 2007, Educational Attainment and Society. And in that book, I mapped 3 basic ways educationalists have thought about explaining socioeconomic differences in education. So what I refer to as the old sociology of education existed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in Britain and the US. And basically in this post-World War II period, there was a belief that material inequality was declining with, certainly in the case of the UK, the introduction of things like the welfare state. And researchers who conducted surveys on differential performance at school, for example, in terms of the 11+ examination in Britain, they became concerned with things like cultural factors influencing the achievement of working class pupils. And I call these factorial approaches because they tended to generate list-like explanations. They tended to be a shopping list of all those factors that could negatively influence the performance of the working class. And obviously, the opposites would positively influence the achievement of the middle class. In this approach, we had things like cultural deprivation, deprivation of values, deprivation of commitment to hard work, a lack of ability to defer gratification. We had exploration of students' aspirations. What job did they want? Did they want to go to university? Exploration of family size, housing, diet, speech patterns. All these factors were put together to give us a sort of rough map of the territory influencing the achievement of different classes. And my big criticism of this type of approach is a list of factors doesn't give you a coherent theoretical explanation, which is what I've tried to work to in terms of my own research. By the time we get to the 1970s, this type of work, the old sociology of education, focusing on class and factors, was replaced, oddly enough, by the new sociology of education, which much more strongly explored economic factors. So we had feminist researchers, radical researchers, critical researchers, Marxists, exploring the reproduction of the labour market and arguing that schools in and of themselves existed to reproduce social inequality. And the classic study cited all the time in this approach is the work of Paul Willis, Learning to Labour, where he actually looks at working class boys in school and their practices and how the way they're treated in school and the way they respond to school predisposes them to the rejection of the school and the acceptance of factory labour as a future occupational trajectory. So the evolution of explanations has moved from a factorial approach to an approach emphasising economic and cultural reproduction. By the time we get to the 1990s, explanations of educational inequality have become much more diverse. Rather than focusing on either social class, as in the 1950s, or gender and ethnicity in the 70s and 80s, we see approaches which look at the intersection of gender, ethnicity, and class, which is where I would place my own research. In the early 90s, there was a lot of research on masculinity, social class, and attainment, and particularly reasons why working class boys, both black and white, tended to underachieve in school. And most recently, from 2009 onwards, we've seen a lot of work on aspirations, attitudes, and behaviours, which looks at the impact of pupils' and parents' aspirations for education, on their success at school, and their progression to higher education. Now, I'm not going to give away the story too much. I mean, in my own work, I've argued very strongly that none of these approaches are sufficient, and I'm much more in favour of a holistic approach which treats factors together and explores the aggregate lifestyle of pupils. So what works? It's all well and good me sitting here and pontificating about patterns of inequality and the extent of inequality and explanations of inequality. But we also need to start thinking about what can be done practically to try and reduce socioeconomic inequalities, both in school outcomes and in progression to higher education. And here I've selected sort of 4 key focuses. So some strategies focus on changing the curriculum, changing teaching methods, changing the ethos of the school. But this is about creating a curriculum and a school environment appropriate to different and diverse pupils from social backgrounds. So for example, when I first started teaching in the early 1980s, I was remarkably impressed by many of the English literature teachers I worked with, and female teachers really strongly trying to see the incorporation of Black authors into the curriculum and syllabus so as to represent a more diverse student body. Under New Labour, we saw a huge amount of effort placed on raising the educational and occupational aspirations of working class pupils and parents. This is the sort of AAB, aspirations, attitudes and behaviour research, which is rather unkindly sometimes being referred to as cloning the Blairs, as in Cherie and Tony Blair, parents, middle class, children doing reasonably well in education, and replicating the values of that type of family to try and encourage children to see the merit of succeeding in school, of progressing to university, in order to improve their life chances through social mobility. We've also seen, and I think this is one that's often underestimated in the academic literature, attempt to improve resources for schools. So under the coalition government, we saw the introduction of the pupil premium. Previously, we've seen the introduction of the educational maintenance allowance as an attempt to encourage less advantaged students to stay on from the age of 16, for example, in further education colleges. And some of the research, for example, into EMA showed that it was relatively effective at encouraging students from less advantaged backgrounds in staying on in further education, although of course subsequently EMA was effectively scrapped. And most recently, under the coalition government and the current government, we've seen a lot of emphasis placed on universities themselves and making universities responsible for monitoring the occupational destinations of the students they teach to see whether or not universities promote upward social mobility. I'll say a little bit in a moment about the relative effects of these different types of strategies, what works. But I think probably the most important message from my own reading in this field over the years and my own research is it's probably a mistake to treat these things in isolation, to think just raising aspirations will improve working class achievement if you are not changing wider socioeconomic conditions, just changing teaching methods in isolation from funding. So my argument would be we need to look at students' aggregate lifestyles, and we also need to think of a plurality of educational interventions to tackle the socioeconomic gap in school outcomes and progression to higher education. Okay. To draw things to a conclusion, Since I've been working in the field of educational research, the evidence has tended to suggest that there's been a closure or reversal of the gender gap in performance at school. So, for example, in the 1960s, boys outperformed girls. And now we see that girls outperform boys in just about every subject. But the research evidence on the socio-economic gap in achievement is much more depressing. It tends to show by most measures that the gap between middle and working class has tended to persist. And certainly in terms of my own PhD research, I found between GCSE and A-level, the gap in performance between working and middle class pupils persisted. And moreover, it was 5 times greater than gender inequalities in education. Now, as I said when I was talking about the media, there's been a huge resurrection of interest in these debates in the last 3 or 4 months with the impact of lockdown and the impact of homeschooling on disadvantaged pupils. Do they have access to, for example, laptop resources? Do they have access to parents who can encourage and guide them through home study? Do they have access to sufficient resources like meals and food to allow them to concentrate? Much of the research evidence that does exist tends to suggest that interventions that have been designed to promote working class attainment, things like excellence in cities, have been relatively or have had relatively limited effect. And also research into the effectiveness of initiatives to widen participation show that they have relative limited effect. And in part, as we saw on one of the earlier slides, this is because as more and more disadvantaged pupils enter higher education, we saw that on one of the tables, the gap tends to persist because middle class pupils continue to enter in increased numbers, which maintains the gap. The message of my research in the sociology of education and education studies more broadly, I think, is both optimistic and pessimistic. I think it's optimistic because if we look since the 1960s, we've seen quite a remarkable transformation in the educational opportunities and outcomes of women in society. We've seen a dramatic improvement and reversal in the gender gap, certainly at GCSE and A-level, although disparities exist in subjects taken and performance in some elite universities. However, there's been a lot less evidence related to improvements in the performance in terms of the socioeconomic gap. It has been stubbornly persistent. And one of the concerns I have about this is that successive governments have tended to use piecemeal policies, the pupil premium, Sure Start. And as I said earlier, I think policies to tackle inequalities, socioeconomic inequality, need to be much more rounded, much more holistic. They need to take an aggregate approach, tackling the school curriculum, pupils' aspirations, school funding. So it needs to be a much broader package. And we need to move away from focusing on changing working class children. And we need to think about changing education and society in total to understand educational inequality and to tackle it.